This is Branko Malic of Kali Tribune. In this podcast we'll attempt to draw the distinction between two notions, the notions of conservatism and the notion of tradition. And we'll illustrate this by paying homage to dearly departed Mr. Roger Scruton, English conservative philosopher, whom I would consider an epitome of modern conservative. And any critical remarks about Mr. Scruton are just here to illustrate the difference between conservative and traditional stance. Because just to point out from the outset, conservatism does not have its equivalent in traditionalism, because adherence to tradition is not an ism. Now, Mr. Scruton, who was greatly respected by many people, and some of those people being rather closer to what I would call traditional mentality than conservative mentality, had some remarks about religion that I consider very important for our subject at hand, that is the making of the said distinction between two notions. In one interview, which I will only paraphrase, he said that he was always fond of Catholic Church. By the way, he was an Anglican. He was a member of English Anglican Church. That in Catholicism, he was very attracted to Catholicism for some reasons, some of them being private and personal. He never really converted and joined the church. But there was also one principal thing that stopped him from going all the way into becoming a member of traditional religion. And this he illustrates with his customarily understated irony. The interviewer asked him about the notion or the faith in eternal life, which is the let's say one of the dimensions of the principle out of which Christianity stems. Scruton said, and I paraphrase him here, that as regards eternal life, he thinks, well, one life is quite enough. Meaning, of course, that this finite life time span, his was, I think, 75 years, is quite enough for what he wants of the world, the God, the religion, and so on and so forth. I think this statement kind of already implicitly delineates the way conservatives think and the way that somebody adhering to tradition think. Scruton's assumption here is that his own choice, the choice of taste, which is very important, his both ethical, aesthetical, and intellectual intention, personal subjective intention, is what makes the principle he is adhering to valid or invalid. This stance is not a Christian stance. That is to say, and I consider this equivalent, this is not traditional sense. That is to say, the sense that would be uttered by somebody adhering to tradition. Because the eternal life in Christian sense is not something that should be understood as something you want or do not want, or that you like or do not like. This is a fact you have to deal with, whether you like it or not. Moreover, the Christian understanding of eternal life does not necessarily imply a happy eternal life. For me, it is obvious, not only from this quote, but I read some Scruton's books and read interviews, listened to his lectures. It is obvious that his stance had nothing to do with it, and I think that he would not be able to accept it. I think that he would not be able to accept the notion that can be summed up as following. Tradition has a necessary vector that guides our thinking, and this vector is a necessity of the existence of eternal past sense. And this eternal past sense, not in a grammatical meaning of the term, but in the sense of perennial or incessant and constant recurrence to something that is forever in our past, is the mainstay, and it's a necessary condition for traditional mentality. Now, this notion of eternal past, of which we already spoke and wrote about on Kali Tribune, is not primarily to be understood temporal. It is a rather logical necessity, that is to say, the necessity of that guides the human spirit or human mind towards its proper grounding in the principle that transcends it. This means that everything that is comes from the cause, and that in the sense of causality, the cause is always in the past for its effects, and we, human beings, are indeed ultimately the effects of one ultimate cause, and this cause is, to our view, as its effects, that is to say, as its creations, always before us. So traditional adherence to past is in fact not adherence to past forms of human culture, but adherence to what is in eternity, in past, eternal past. Now there are, we can when we talk about this, some kind of vectors of eternity, like past, present and future in eternity, this is very profound and a bit slippery subject, so we won't go too deep into it, but I think it is quite justified to say that eternal cause can be understood only as being in origin, as being indeed being an origin, or the origin of all. And traditional notion always recurs to this. There is no tradition without understanding this, and this also means that tradition as a body of, let's say, knowledge, of mores, of religious rites, maybe of art, of a whole lot of things, is an expression of this, and is always expression of this. To a conservative mind, I would posit this is completely unacceptable. Conservative stance and arguments coming from it relies upon assumption that we have to conserve and protect the forms of living, communal living mostly, and expressions of knowledge and art, that a human, this is very important to stress, that somehow worked in the past, and that we are not to run too rashly into changing them. This assumption is based on the worldview and mentality that is built upon or stems from something diametrically opposed to what traditional mentality stems from. And this is the notion that origin, or the purpose, let's say, in this sense, the cause of why we are doing anything, is in the future. Because this is conservatism as a modern ideology, let's call it, for the lack of a better term, or conservative, kind of conservative metaphysics, better to say. Therefore, it is tied faithfully, in the sense of faith, not faith as a belief in something, but faith as destiny, to modern world. And my opinion is, broad and roughly sketched as it may be, that modernity not only approaches its end, but that it really ended. At least in those parts of the world where it reigned. And I think there are a lot of signs of this. And as such, it just, with dissolution of itself, it brought about the solution of any meaning of conservatism whatsoever. This does not mean, however, that conservative achievements of conservative thinkers as late Mr. Scruton are worthless. This is not the case, because from the traditional point of view, nothing can exist and be totally worthless. Only totally worthless thing is nothingness. But problem is that a root of modernity seems to be precisely this nothingness. Nothingness of the principle according to which there is no such thing as eternal past, to which you must recur, eternal beginning, from which everything flows. Now this flowing has in a traditional sense, has a very marked and discernible logical structure that has to be borne in mind, either intuitively and implicitly, or indeed made aware and explicit. And this is the principle according to which each effect proceeds from the cause, remains in the cause, and returns to the cause, to some extent. The stronger the cause, or the origin, which is not always the same thing, but now I'm using them as synonyms, the stronger it is, the more inner and less external it is. And the ultimate cause is internal to everything. It is present, ever present to everything. So its past is not the past of the past time, because the past for it. But the past of that which is ever present and to which everything recurs back. The past is therefore a symbol, a temporal symbol for something that transcends time. Now, with modernity, I would say this is rejected, and even people like Mr. Scruton rejected it. Only let's talk about him. He had this intuition and good sense to understand that progressivism, to use the term as a working term to put something that is opposite to conservatism, because modernity always works dialectically in opposites, that progressivism is ruining what is good. And the way to recognize what is good is not to recur to the origin, but to recur to good practices. And the criterion of these good practices, what makes something good, beautiful, or true, is indeed subjective. And then people like Scruton, or Scruton himself, try to give some reasons why is this so. And most often those reasons are not entirely rational. They are built upon, for instance, assumption that we cannot understand why some of our practices are good, but they are nevertheless good. They produce good, even in pragmatic sense, or in the sense that a great deal of people, the very fact that a great deal of people adhere to them for a long time justifies them. And there is a lot of truth to this, but not entire truth. And when an epoch comes to its close, as I think is the case of modernity, some truth just won't do. It would have to be all truth. And all truth is something that conservatism cannot have by its very nature. So when we talk about dissolution of modernity, I think that Mr. Scruton, for instance, would have no problems with noticing that popular culture, and by this I mean culture of Hollywood movies, comic book heroes and so on, is now dissolving. I don't know have anybody listening to this have noticed, but I have noticed that new Hollywood movies that are, for instance, movies that do deal with popular comic book heroes, or above all, Star Wars series, that I haven't seen any of its episodes for years, but I noticed that this series is now in the process of dissolving its basis, that is to say, the characters that were dearly beloved, especially by Americans, and the whole mythopoetic structure of this science fiction movie series has been dissolved, and this hurts a lot of feelings. Well, it is interesting to note that Mr. Scruton would have nothing against this, I think, but would have a lot of against, for instance, not people not being obliged to read somebody like Thomas Mann or T.S. Eliot and such. But what I think that we see before ourselves is just stage of dissolution that was implied even in the greatest achievements of modernity. Some thinkers even posited that the whole of modernity in its intellectual self-reflective sense could be summed up into dissolution of Hegel's system, because Hegel's system of philosophy, and it was a system by definition, his own definition, was maybe the peak of the metaphysics that metaphysics could achieve in modernity, and very soon turned upon itself and ended up being dissolved into its own caricatures or into parts the other philosophies that just took bits and pieces and then dissolved more and more and more and more. It's a wide subject, but I think to get back to popular culture, to really pedestrian, the most pedestrian level on which we can talk about, the dissolution of popular culture, I think, is a sign that everything that was created in modernity is turning upon itself to a result that we cannot even dream to predict. So when you take, for instance, these Star Wars movies, I remember one thing. The first Star Wars movie, when I saw it, I didn't realize this, I was much younger, but when I started thinking about it, I noticed after some time that scenes from this movie that are some kind of dogfights in space by spaceships, between spaceships, are mirror image of what you see in propaganda reels, American propaganda reels from the Second World War, mainly from the war in Pacific theater, where Americans achieved great victories. The movie simply reflects some of the greatest achievements of USA in the 20th century and uses paradigmatic characters as heroes that are paradigmatic to what Americans would understand as heroes in the real world, not only in space opera, in quote-unquote outer space. So the basis of these movies is, in my opinion, a kind of civil religion, maybe left unspoken of in public, but which makes it even stronger in its influence. And the dissolution of the iconography of these movies, this popular culture iconography, is just mirroring the dissolution of this culture and this civil religion. So this is the destiny, but this is the destiny of everything that is based, well, on nothing. That is based on imitating the origin while denying the possibility, if not of origin itself, or then at least of returning into it, or remaining into it, or doing anything while still remaining rooted in the origin. For modern mind, I think this very notion, and as such, therefore, conservatism and tradition have very little to do with one another. I would even say that conservatism is a kind of, even a bit of a parody of tradition. Now, I'm talking in taking a widest moves of the brush to paint a sketch. I want this to be apprehended by anybody listening to me. There are a lot of nuances to this, but I think the principal thing holds. The principle that this inalienability from origin is the principle of tradition. And this is the reason why, in adhering to tradition, in belonging really to religion, to give it a concrete form, is erasing this dichotomy between optimism and pessimism that exists with progressives and conservatives, because this transcends both. Optimism and pessimism are related towards the future and are, as a metaphysical attitudes, really modern notions. So conservatives really have this melancholic, and late Mr. Scruton, I think, had it, this melancholic sense of continuous defeat. simply because I think in the back of their minds they still thought that the future is the only vector towards we can move. But this is not true. This is only true if modern mentality or modern principle reigns in our minds. If not, things radically change. And to conclude, and just to say, maybe it is a bit impolite to use recently passed good man to illustrate some failings of the attitude he held. Well, I'm sorry if anybody thinks that, because I do consider, and this is the most important thing, that Roger Scruton was a good man. It kind of shines through his acts, and he was very jovial and very, I would say, even very courageous man, especially for his work in Eastern Europe, in Czechoslovakia at that time now, Czech Republic, and Poland, in helping out dissidents, in holding underground seminaries and so on. That took quite a courage, and was vilified by his opponents from the left in a despicable manner, because nobody can vilify you as despicably as adherents of radical left. So this is not to denigrate him, but I think that one has to put these distinctions if one wants to distinguish between truth and half-truth. And as I said, in times like this, I don't think half-truths do. They don't help very much. Anyway, this was my 5 cents on distinction between conservatism and tradition, and at the same time, I hope a bit of critical eulogy to late Mr. Roger Scruton. Thank you for your attention. This was Branko Malic of Kali Tribune, signing out.